Welcome to See Crime Stories, true stories of the missing and the pursuit of answers. Tonight we go back to August 1996, to a quiet Ohio town where a 22-year-old woman disappeared between her front door and the rest of her life, and neither she, nor her car, has ever been seen again. Her name is Clarissa Ann Carey Culberson. Not a drifter. Not a runaway. A young woman with a tight circle of friends, a close relationship with her mother, a routine, a job, a red Honda CRX everyone in Blanchester recognized on sight. On paper, she was exactly the kind of person who does not simply vanish. Wednesday night, August 28th, Carey spends the evening the way a lot of small-town 20-somethings did in the mid-90s, playing volleyball, laughing with friends, nothing dramatic. Multiple witnesses later confirm her mood was normal. No packed bags. No talk of leaving town. No new secret life waiting somewhere else. Shortly before midnight, a friend drives her back toward her house. That drop-off, around 11:30 p.m., is the last independently confirmed sighting of Carey alive. What investigators reconstruct next is brutally simple. On the morning of August 29th, Carey does not show up for work. That is the first alarm. She is known as reliable. Her employer calls. There is no answer. Her mother tries to reach her. Nothing. Hours pass. Still no contact. When family check, they find an empty house, lights off, no signs of a struggle, no note, no suitcase missing. But one detail stands out: the red Honda CRX is gone. For seasoned detectives, that combination lands hard. No voluntary exit indicators. No activity on her routine commitments. No calls home. Entire vehicle unaccounted for. It is not evidence of death, but it is evidence of disruption. Local law enforcement open a missing person report. At first, some treat it as a possible cooling-off period after relationship problems. That assumption will matter later. For now, the record shows early interviews, confirmation of the last known timeline, and a single, immovable fact: sometime after 11:30 p.m., both Carey and her car leave that neighborhood and never come back. As the hours turn into the first night, the case has no body, no confirmed crime scene, no 911 call, and no obvious forensic trail. What it does have, almost immediately, is a pattern in Carey's recent history that points investigators in a very specific direction, a direction many people in Blanchester had already been worried about. From a young woman marked as missing, to a nobody homicide prosecution built on behavior, history, and choices made in those first critical days. By the time detectives sat down at Carey Culberson's kitchen table, the missing person form wasn't the most important document in front of them. What changed the tone of this case was the paper trail that already existed: complaints, reports, medical records, court dates, showing that what happened to Carey on August 28, 1996, did not come out of nowhere. In any real investigation, one of the first questions is simple: has this person ever asked for help? With Carey, the answer was yes. Officers reviewing her history learned about a long, unstable relationship with a man from the same area, someone viewers will recognize from public records and trial coverage. For this stage of the story, what matters is how that relationship looked on paper. There were documented incidents of violence. A smashed car window with Carey inside. A head injury serious enough to require medical treatment. A report that she had been held against her will and threatened with a firearm days before she disappeared. These were not rumors, they were allegations formally reported, backed by visible injuries and witness statements, scheduled to be examined in court. Investigators saw that a misdemeanor assault case connected to this history was set for early September 1996. That meant Carey was not only an ex-girlfriend, she was a complainant. Legally, she was on a path that could put consequences on someone who already had a record of losing control. When a young woman under those circumstances vanishes less than 2 weeks before she is due in front of a judge, that timing becomes a lead you cannot ignore. Detectives pulled the prior reports and walked them against what they were hearing from her family and friends. They heard about controlling behavior, anger when Carey tried to pull away, direct threats that no one would find her if she ever crossed him. Those closest to her said the fear was real, but so was her determination to be done. She was trying to separate, to rebuild a normal life. That contrast, her effort to move on versus his refusal to accept it, was consistent across sources. For a case built with no body and no car, this background wasn't filler. It was structure. It established risk. It narrowed the field. It told investigators that Carrie's disappearance could not be treated as random or voluntary without ignoring everything she had already tried to say while she was still alive. From a procedural standpoint, this is where the file shifts. The missing person checklist runs parallel to a threat assessment. Detectives start prioritizing interviews not just with friends from volleyball or coworkers, but with the one person repeatedly linked to violence in Carrie's life. They map out the days leading up to August 28th, who she spoke to, whether she mentioned new threats, whether there were attempts to reconcile or confront. They are looking for escalation, any sign that words had moved closer to action. For viewers, this is an important point to sit with. In many intimate partner cases across the United States, the warning signs are not hidden. They are written in reports, visible in injuries, heard in arguments next door. The gap is not always knowledge, it is follow-through. Carrie's file, even at this early stage, is an example of how much we often know about the danger facing a victim before the moment they disappear. As the investigation advances, the pattern in those documents will push law enforcement toward one primary suspect. But at this stage of the timeline, the job is not to jump to a conclusion on camera or on paper. The job is to show you why, step by step, they stopped looking at Carrie as missing for personal reasons and started treating her case as a likely act of violence that had been building for months. If you have ever wondered whether reports, photos, and protective hearings matter in real life, this is one of those cases that answers that question. They mattered enough to frame the entire direction of a homicide case without a body. By the end of the first day, the file on Clarissa and Carrie Culberson's disappearance no longer looked like a routine welfare check. It looked unfinished. Too many blanks, and one of them was the size of a car. Detectives started with what they could verify. Carrie had been dropped near her home in Blanchester, Ohio, late on the night of August 28, 1996. The friend who drove her had a consistent account. The time window was clear. There was no sign she had packed, no calls to suggest a sudden trip, no history of disappearing on her family. So the next logical step was simple: if she left, how, and with what? Her red Honda CRX was key. People in town recognized it. It was small, distinctive, and, like Carrie herself, it did not just blend into the background. When officers checked the driveway and the immediate area, the car was gone. That detail, on its own, did not prove a crime. But every hour they could not place that vehicle, the options narrowed. They ran the standard checks. No impound. No accident reports matching her plate. No record of the car abandoned on the side of a state route. Hospitals in the region had no unidentified patient fitting her description pulled from a wreck in a red Honda. Local and neighboring agencies were notified. If the car had been left in the open, it should have surfaced quickly. It did not. Inside the house, what they saw matched what family had already told them: normal personal items, unfinished routines, nothing that looked like preparation to move. No visible struggle, no forced entry, nothing obvious to tag as a confirmed crime scene. That absence matters. In an FBI-style review, silence in the physical environment is evidence too. It suggests she left the property area, willingly or not, without leaving a trace that could be read in a few quick passes. What pushed this further was the timeline. People close to Carrie tried to reach her early. When contact failed, they did not wait days to report it. That fast response gave investigators a tighter frame to work with. It also meant that if something had happened to her during the night, whoever was responsible had acted and cleared out within a small window, before anyone started looking. For an investigator, a narrow window connected to an existing high-risk history is not an abstract pattern. It is probable cause to dig deeper. As they reconstructed the final hours, detectives documented who called whom, who saw what, and whether anyone reported seeing the Honda on the streets after midnight. Here, The record is telling for what it does not contain. No solid, independent sightings of Carrie driving away to start a new life. No confirmation that she was behind the wheel after that drop-off. The narrative of she just took off had nothing concrete behind it. This is where the missing hunch shifts from a detail to a red flag. In many cases, when adults choose to disappear, money moves, phones light up, cars get spotted. With Carrie, there was nothing visible. Both she and her vehicle were removed from the grid in the same slice of time. For law enforcement and for viewers who follow real cases, that combination is not noise, it is a pattern that strongly suggests an external decision took over her freedom of movement. The human side cannot be ignored, even in a cold procedural review. Her mother and sister were not dealing with a vague feeling. They were confronting hard facts: no contact, no car, no answers from anyone who should have known her plans. They did what families are supposed to do. They reported quickly. They cooperated. They handed over everything that might help. That cooperation is one reason this case did not stay labeled as maybe she left for long. In this stage of the investigation, the focus quietly shifted. It was no longer just where's Carrie. It became who had the access, the motive, and the time to move both Carrie and that car without leaving a public trail. That is not a dramatic line for television. It is the practical question that drives the next steps in any serious nobody case. For anyone watching who has seen similar situations, this part of the story carries a simple, important point. When a person at known risk goes dark and their vehicle vanishes with them, it is not overreacting to treat it as potential foul play early. It is protecting the narrow window where real evidence still exists. When a young woman disappears without a trace, investigators start wide. In the Culberson case, that window closed fast. Once the missing vehicle, the tight timeline, and the documented violence were on the table, the search didn't stay general. It narrowed onto the people who had both access to Carrie Culberson and a documented history of volatility around her. Within days of her August 28, 1996 disappearance from Blanchester, Ohio, detectives moved from background checks to direct pressure. They sat down with the man at the center of her prior reports. On record, he offered an account of his night, his contact with Carrie, and his knowledge of her movements. On paper, it sounded simple. Too simple. The next step was not to argue with his version, but to test it. Investigators did what solid case work requires. They pulled phone activity where available, reconfirmed the drop-off time from Carrie's friend, and locked in the statements from family members who tried to reach her and could not. None of that material suggested she had planned to leave town, reconnect in secret, or vanish on her own. More importantly, parts of his timeline did not line up cleanly with the independent accounts they were collecting. Small discrepancies matter in a nobody case. They are often the only measurable difference between truth and reconstruction. Witness interviews around the neighborhood added another layer. People living near the property linked to this man described previous conflicts, loud arguments, and incidents that matched the pattern already sitting in Carrie's file. Those are not convictions by themselves. But for investigators trained to map risk, they are data points. Each one either reinforces or weakens a version of events. In this case, the version presented by the person closest to her recent violence history started to drift away from the rest. Detectives documented every inconsistency instead of dramatizing it. Times that shifted between tellings. Descriptions of contact with Carrie that changed as more questions were asked. Explanations that did not address the missing Honda CRX in any verifiable way. There was still no body, no recovered car, no classic crime scene inside her home. But the statements themselves were becoming evidence about credibility, opportunity, and control over the narrative. From a procedural point of view, this is where the Culberson investigation stops resembling a generic missing adult file and starts to look like the early build of a nobody homicide case. Not because anyone jumped ahead on emotion, but because the only person whose account should have been precise kept moving the goalposts, while the risk factors around Carrie were already confirmed in prior reports. In no-body prosecutions across the United States, this pattern repeats. When physical evidence is thin, testimonial evidence and behavior under scrutiny becomes central. There is a human side running parallel that your viewers understand instinctively. Families rarely get the luxury of legal language. They watch interviews, they hear shifting stories, and they feel what the report later reflects. If you care about someone who has vanished, you do not need multiple drafts of your timeline. That reaction is not proof, but it aligns with why trained investigators pay attention when one person's story refuses to hold still. By the end of this phase, the case against an unknown offender was quietly becoming the case against a known individual. The file now contained a defined last seen window, a missing vehicle, a documented history of violence, and a set of statements from one man that did not match the fixed points. That did not yet answer where Carrie was, or how she had been taken out of her life. It did establish something crucial. If this was foul play, the circle of likely responsibility was no longer wide. Handled right, telling this part of the story is not about rushing to label someone for dramatic effect. It is about showing how real investigations use records, timelines, and inconsistent statements to move from speculation to focus. It is also a reminder that when patterns of abuse are documented and then dismissed, the system is forced to build murder cases later with fewer tools than it should have had at the start. In cases with no body and no car, any credible lead on where a victim might have been taken is critical. In the disappearance of Clarissa and Carrie Culberson, that lead came early, and how it was handled became one of the most serious failures in the entire investigation. As detectives tightened their focus, information drew them to property connected to the Baker family, relatives of the man already under scrutiny. It was not a random search. There were known ties between the suspect and that land, and there was enough concern about what could be hidden there to justify bringing in outside resources. For a nobody case, a controlled search of any site with that kind of connection can be the difference between circumstantial suspicion and hard evidence. Search teams arrived with cadaver dogs. The priority area included a pond on or near the property, a location that, if used to conceal a body or a vehicle, could hold traces long after the act. Multiple accounts and later legal records indicate that at least one dog showed interest consistent with possible human decomposition. On a checklist, that is a box you never ignore: high-risk victim, tied source, positive indication from trained dogs. The next step should have been straightforward and strict. Secure the scene. Lock it down. Maintain continuous control until the water could be properly drained, the bottom examined, and any potential remains or evidence documented according to procedure. That is the standard expectation in serious felony investigations across the United States, especially when officials are dealing with a missing woman who reported violence before she vanished. That did not happen here. Instead, the pond area was left without constant law enforcement guard for a period during the search operation. By the time authorities moved forward with draining and examination, the scene was no longer in the condition it had been when the dogs first alerted. There were allegations later that vehicles and individuals had access to that property in the gap. Whether or not every claim can be fully proven, one fact is clear and uncontested in the public record: the security of a potential evidence site was compromised. When divers and investigators finally worked the pond, they did not recover Carrie Culberson. They did not recover her red Honda CRX. They did not secure the kind of physical proof that could close every argument in court or answer her family's most basic question: where is she? On paper, the result is nothing found. In context, it is more complicated. Nothing found at a scene that was never fully protected is not the same as nothing was ever there. From a case-building perspective, this moment cuts two ways. On one hand, it feeds the narrative of those who believe this investigation was flawed to the point of being unfair. On the other, it supports the concern of those who see it as evidence of local protection and delayed accountability. For Carrie's mother, for her sister, and for people who track nobody homicides, it reads as a lost chance. If something tied to Carrie was in that water and was moved, the mistake helped bury more than evidence. It helped bury certainty. This is also where leadership decisions come into focus. The police chief responsible for the call not to secure that scene would later face consequences for his handling of the search. That outcome matters. It acknowledges, formally, that the response to Carrie's disappearance did not meet the standard she deserved. It also sends a message beyond Blanchester. Failures in the first days of a missing person investigation echo for decades, especially when prosecutors are later asked to persuade a jury without a body. The point is not to create a conspiracy where the record does not support one. It is to be clear about what is known. There was a high-value search location, connected to the suspect's extended circle. There were dog alerts. There was a lapse in securing that location. There was no recovery of Carrie or her car. These are facts, not speculation, and they sit at the center of why this case would ultimately proceed as a no-body prosecution built heavily on behavior, records, and credibility, rather than on a single conclusive forensic find. Once the pond search failed to deliver answers, there were only two options for investigators in Clinton County and Blanchester: walk the case back to missing and let it fade, or accept what the pattern already indicated and start treating this as a homicide with no body. They chose the second. By late 1996, the Culberson file contained several elements that rarely appear together in a genuine voluntary disappearance. Clarissa and Carrie Culberson had reported violence. She had a pending assault case involving the same man she was trying to move on from. She vanished days before she was due in court. Her car vanished with her. A property tied to that man's family triggered cadaver dog interest and was not fully secured. And the one person who should have been able to give a clean, consistent account of his contact with her was unable to keep his story straight. At this stage, the work became less about searching roadsides and fields, and more about tightening the record. Detectives and prosecutors went back through every prior statement from the primary suspect and his relatives. They compared versions given to deputies, to the sheriff's office, to friends, to others in his circle. When you lay them next to each other, certain details no longer matched, times shifted, claimed sightings of Carrie moved, and explanations for the night of August 28 evolved after each round of questioning. Those shifts were documented, not dramatized, and they would matter later. Witnesses from inside that extended circle added further weight. Testimony and later court records describe behavior in the hours and days after Carrie's disappearance that did not look like shock or concern. There were reports of trips made late at night, of cleaning, of conversations that suggested people were worried less about a missing woman and more about what law enforcement might find. One relative, Tracy Baker, would eventually face charges related to obstruction and tampering. That alone tells you investigators saw more than bad optics. They believed they could prove active interference with their work. At the same time, investigators confirmed what they did not have. No credible evidence that Carrie had accessed bank accounts, contacted friends, or tried to build a life somewhere else. No independent sighting of her or her Honda CRX after the friend dropped her off. No trace of that small red car turning up in another state under a new registration or obvious fraudulent VIN. In many open missing cases, those gaps keep the door open for multiple theories. Here, stacked against the threats she had reported and the timing of her disappearance, those gaps pointed in one direction. For the prosecutor's office, the question became whether this was enough to take in front of a grand jury without a recovered body or vehicle. By 1997, they decided it was. The case theory was straightforward and tough. Carrie Culberson was dead, she did not walk away, and the person responsible was the one who had the motive to silence her before she could testify. The access to her on the night she vanished, the inconsistent statements afterward, and a circle that moved in ways consistent with concealment, not confusion. Filing those charges in a no-body case is not a media stunt. It is a legal risk. If a jury does not believe the pattern, there is no partial win. But in this instance, investigators and prosecutors were willing to stand on the combined weight of everything they had built: the history of violence, the documented threats, the last known movements, the missing car, the compromised search, the evolving stories, and the acts of obstruction tied to the same orbit. For people in Blanchester and for those who follow real cases like this, that decision carried a message. Even when a victim has not been brought home, the system will not always wait for perfect evidence. Sometimes, the only way to answer a family is to ask 12 jurors to read the record and decide what those facts, taken together, really mean. When the case of Clarissa and Carrie Culberson reached an Ohio courtroom in 1997, everyone in that room knew what was missing. No body. No red Honda CRX. No single piece of physical evidence that could be held up and labeled as the cause of death. The question for the jury was whether the pattern was strong enough to stand in place of what they would never see. Prosecutors presented a clear narrative, grounded in records instead of speculation. They walked the jury through Carrie's documented history with Vincent Doan, prior assaults, visible injuries, reports to law enforcement, and the pending criminal case in which she was set to testify against him. Those weren't character attacks, they were entries in official files, establishing motive and showing the pressure he was under in the weeks before she disappeared. They then froze the timeline on the night of August 28, 1996. Independent witnesses placed Carrie being dropped near her home shortly before midnight. After that point, only a small number of people could have had access to her. The state argued that Doan was in that group, with both proximity and opportunity. Jurors heard how his statements about that night had shifted, what time he claimed contact, how he described her leaving, what he said about seeing or not seeing her car. None of those changes helped his credibility. Witnesses from his circle, including relatives, added key details under oath. Their accounts helped place Doan's movements and behavior in the hours after Carrie vanished. Parts of that testimony supported the allegation that there were efforts to clean up or move evidence and that certain family members were more focused on legal exposure than on finding a missing woman. Charges later brought against Tracy Baker for obstructing justice and tampering with evidence underscored that concern. Investigators and prosecutors believed some of what happened after August 28 was not simply panic. It was deliberate. The pawn search failure also entered the story, not as a solved scene, but as context. Jurors heard that cadaver dogs had shown interest on property linked to Doan's family, that the area was not fully secured, and that by the time it was drained, nothing conclusive remained. The state's position was simple: this mishandling did not clear anyone. If anything, it left open the possibility that crucial evidence had been removed. The defense strategy was direct: no body, no car, no weapon, no definitive forensic link. They reminded the jury that Carrie had not been found, that every conclusion about her fate relied on inferences from behavior and circumstance. They attacked the reliability of witnesses, suggested inconsistencies in memories, and argued that the state had built a theory around a man they already disliked. In a no-body case, that argument usually lands with some force. But here, jurors had to weigh it against a consistent foundation: a young woman with a stable life and active plans, a trail of documented violence and threats from the man now on trial, a disappearance that aligned with his legal exposure, a missing vehicle tied forever to the same night, compromised searches connected to his family, and post-incident conduct the state framed as consciousness of guilt. After hearing that record, the jury returned its answer. Vincent Doan was found guilty of aggravated murder and kidnapping in connection with the disappearance and presumed death of Carrie Culberson. He was sentenced to life in prison. The verdict did not locate her remains and did not recover the Honda. It did something narrower and specific. Under the law of the state of Ohio, it fixed responsibility on one offender for what happened in Blanchester in August 1996. For Carrie's family, the decision mattered. It recognized that what happened to her was not a mystery to be minimized as she just left. But the core wound of the case remained. Even with a conviction, there was still no place to visit, no car to examine, no physical point of closure. The verdict against Vincent Doan settled what the law could say about what happened to Clarissa and Carrie Culberson. It did not answer the question that has kept her case alive for nearly 3 decades: where is she? After Doan was convicted in 1997 of aggravated murder and kidnapping, his attorneys challenged the result. Appellate courts reviewed the same building blocks the jury had seen: the history of violence, the documented threats, the timing of Carrie's disappearance just before she was due in court, the missing Honda CRX, the compromised search activity, the inconsistent statements, and the conduct of people around him after she vanished. Those courts upheld the conviction. On the record, the state's case was strong enough. Legally, Ohio fixed responsibility on one man for what happened on August 28, 1996. Carrie's family then went after a different kind of accountability. In a civil lawsuit, they argued that failures by local officials and specific individuals damaged the investigation and robbed them of a real chance to recover Carrie's remains. A jury agreed in significant part. The civil verdict recognized that key decisions, like not properly securing that pond search, fell below acceptable standards. Money could not repair that damage, but it put in writing something important: the system had not done enough for a young woman who had asked for help before she disappeared. Over the years, there have been searches based on tips and claimed confessions, checks of rural properties, ponds, wells, and structures linked to rumors. None has produced verified remains. None has uncovered her red Honda CRX. No credible evidence has emerged to point to a different offender. Doan maintains his claim of innocence. The courts, after multiple reviews, have maintained his guilt. The legal outcome and the physical absence sit side by side. That is the reality of this case. So this story closes in a very specific place. Carrie Culberson, 22, from Blanchester, Ohio, disappeared in 1996. A jury found that she was killed and that her former boyfriend, Vincent Doan, was responsible. That judgment stands. Her body has never been found. Her car has never been found. There is no second ending where she walked away, and no proven alternative killer waiting off stage. One case. One conclusion in law. One family still waiting for the one piece of proof they have been denied. If there is a message in this case, it is direct. When someone reports escalating violence, it cannot be brushed off as personal drama. Early enforcement of the law is not just about protecting a victim in the moment, it is about preventing the kind of disappearance that leaves families begging for fragments later. When a potential evidence site is identified, it must be secured and processed properly, because there is no replay button once that opportunity is lost. And when a community looks at a case like Carrie's, the most respectful response is not conspiracy or speculation, it is supporting the idea that victims deserve to be believed early, and that those responsible deserve to be held to account, even when the system has to do it without the one piece of evidence it wanted most. Telling Carrie's story reminds me why we can't stay silent about abuse, why we have to take every threat seriously, and why justice matters even when it arrives without the answers we hoped for. If someone in your life makes you uneasy, trust that instinct, speak up, and stand by those who do. I'd like to hear your thoughts. What does this case say to you about courage, systems, and community? Drop a comment, tell me where you're watching from, and if this reached you, please subscribe so you don't miss the next story.